We'll get started, everyone. Welcome to Overseas Development Institute for the event, let's get the name right, Managing Development Agencies from Reform to Renewal. We wanted to have this conversation today because I think we spend a lot of time talking about what aid agencies and their implementers either can or cannot deliver. But we've got an excellent panel here today who can talk a lot about the how aid organisations are organised, structured, some of the tools and processes they use. So we want to dig into the detail of the how today because we know that that really matters for actually what aid organisations and their implementers and partners can deliver on the ground. So I want to thank everyone firstly for taking time out of your busy World Cup viewing schedule. I know that Belgium-Panama is starting imminently, and so if you do want to watch that, this is your last chance to escape. 3 questions today, or maybe 4, depending on how you look at it. So the first is, how should aid organisations be governed and structured? The second one is on what are the pros and cons of results-based management, and are there alternatives to value for money? That's us sneaking in 2 in 1 there. And how can empowering staff be made tangible and still comply with the need to maintain formal accountability to citizens, managers, and politicians? So these questions were somewhat guided by the availability of our panelists today, and we really wanted to get into some of these issues with people that have been writing and thinking about these things for a number of years. So first I'd like to introduce Nilima Gulrajani. To my left is a senior research fellow in the Development Strategy and Finance team here at ODI. She applies organisational and management theory to study trends and practices in the field of international development cooperation. And she was formerly the assistant professor in public management and development at LSE. I'm going to go to Dan while I still remember. Dan, above to my right and behind you over there, is Dan Honig. He's an assistant professor of international development at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And his recent book just out is Navigation by Judgment, Why and When Top-Down Management of Foreign Aid Doesn't Work. Then to the left of Nilima over here, we have Val Ganendran, Director of Finance and Delivery at the Department for International Development, and has worked for the British government for nearly 20 years on international development policy. And finally, at the end there, Pablo Yanguas, last but not least, research fellow at the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Centre and Global Development Institute, that's a real mouthful, at the University of Manchester. His recent book, Why We Lie About Aid, is also just out, and we're really looking forward to hearing from him on that today. So my colleagues in the Development Strategy and Finance team organised this event, partly because they have their advisory panel in town at the moment, so a big welcome to those people who are part of that advisory panel. And that Development Strategy and Finance team, thanks to the contributions of some of these people, supports agencies, development finance actors to respond to evolving trends, challenges and risks. There are also, I'm told, hundreds of people watching this event online, so welcome to everyone there. And I have an iPad somewhere under this paper, and so if you do send in your questions, we will get to them today. Finally, if you could put your phones on silent, but if you want to tweet about it, we strongly encourage it. It's #BetterAid. You can't argue with that. And actually, the final point, if there's a fire, go out the front door, and the bathrooms are just by the lifts over there. So, without further ado, first question I want to put to Nilima. It's how should development agencies be governed and structured? And there's a lot that could come under that question, right? But a thing we want to talk about first is the issue of mergers between development agencies and other departments. And I know that you've written a paper for ODI recently on this. So, what does the evidence tell us about when and how or if mergers are effective?
Thank you. I have 3 minutes in which to answer that question, so it's a mouthful. But basically, I wanted to start by saying that I think there's a propaganda war currently being waged against foreign aid. And in this country, it's very colorfully illustrated with headlines like Fat Cat Bureaucrats, 300K to grow coconuts in the South Pacific. But while it might be less colorful in other countries, the UK is not unique. And there are other countries where I think there is a kind of strong reputational and legitimacy crisis governing development agencies. And this creates a perception of weakness and builds a constituency, really, for major organizational change, like mergers and reforms. So mergers really should be seen against the backdrop, I think, of this reputational crisis and legitimacy crisis, a deliberate act to bring together development agencies, development departments, alongside other government departments, often ministries of foreign affairs. In 2004, we had a merger between NORAD and the MFA. In 2013, Canadian CETA with Global Affairs Canada to create Global Affairs Canada, and in 2013 also Australian aid into DFAT. The mergers are signifiers and symbols of transformation and of a commitment to improving an agency, whether or not those improvements are actually achieved in practice. I think they're also a way to exercise political control, especially if development agencies are perceived as weak. In 2004, the merger of NORAD was largely driven by the Minister of Development wanting to assert authority over NORAD much more than it had been able to previously. CETA's merger and the creation of GAC also came after long-standing criticism of its effectiveness. Point being, mergers are presented as technocratic fixes, but I think are responses to inherently political problems and dilemmas. And what my paper really tries to show is that the justifications for mergers on the grounds of efficiency, impact, and policy coherence, really, there's a mixed record for the achievement of those results in practice. So to answer the question, if I have 1 minute to spare, in terms of how agencies should be structured and governed, I don't think mergers appear to deliver the goods in any real convincing way. The political crisis for aid, however, means that talk of mergers is likely here to stay. And I hate to say it, but the fact that DFID remains the only independent development ministry amongst the DAC makes it, I think, quite vulnerable to a merger. Ultimately, I think we can get results, efficiency, and coherence in any structural form, but that political stewardship is perhaps the most important driver of performance. And unfortunately, it's that stewardship and leadership that's sorely lacking. And finally, I'll just conclude by saying the best thing I think we can do is, if mergers are here to stay, to consider safeguards. So if a merger does happen, we can protect the development project from dilution and distortion. And perhaps later on, I'll get a chance to sort of present some of those ideas for those safeguards that I present in the paper as well.
Perfect, thanks, Neil. Well, I'm perhaps a little bit mean here. I'm going to turn straight to Vel, because we know that this is a really thorny issue for DFID, and it's a very political issue. I suppose the question for someone working for DFID is, what role do you see for DFID? I mean, DFID is still the only independent department, as Liam has mentioned. What role does DFID have to play in money that is being spent, aid money that is being spent by other government departments? What's your role in that?
Thanks, Craig. And firstly, can I just say thank you for inviting me to this event. I'm a finance director, and you don't normally get invited to things as a finance director, so thank you very much. I will answer that question, but I do think it's important to kind of understand some of the wider kind of factors that are at play here, and I kind of put these into three buckets. The first is, quite a deep-seated, both cultural and substantive belief in DFID that the best development comes from local ownership and empowering our country teams to kind of make decisions, and that means we have a very decentralised model. So keep that in your head. At the same time, we are a government department. That means with a protected budget that's under intense and growing scrutiny, which means rightly we have to make sure that we are getting assurance from those frontline teams about how they're spending that money. So that then leads to a lot of process. And then thirdly, recognising the wider UK kind of fiscal environment, our ability to recruit more people is, let's say, not straightforward. So those three factors are at play with DFID, and we are constantly trying to manage that balance, work out how we support our country teams and how we continually change. So it's just worth sort of having that organisational backdrop in the head. And then sort of as we go forward, what are some of the factors? One is definitely this OG, what other government departments are doing with ODA. Let me get the formal bit out of the way. DFID is an independent department. It is government policy to keep DFID as an independent department. I personally don't worry a huge amount about DFID being absorbed into the FCO. Partly, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And secondly, if it did, we would work out a way of, dealing with that. So it's not my job to kind of answer that question, but I don't spend a lot of time worrying about it. I do think we need to think about this policy coherence issue that Nalima flags in her paper. I think we get a lot of that already. I don't think it's, a merger is one way of getting policy coherence, but you can have a lot of other ways of getting policy coherence. So I think let's just make sure we're using those first. There's a lot of talk about the cross-government funds. I'm happy to talk about those. I actually think they do useful things. There are challenges, but we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. What can we do? At the moment, DFID is providing basically a lot of technical assistance to other departments. There is a very live question about what that offer is and how we grow that in light of a lot of the public scrutiny. So I think that's a good question and one we're thinking about very actively.
Thanks. I might come back to you on that, but later. So, Pablo, I wanted to come on to you next because your book subtitle is, The Messy Politics of Change, right? But what we're talking about here is, as Lima's mentioned and Vala's mentioned, is about our own messy politics, right? So I'm interested in your reflections. I mean, it doesn't have to just be about the UK. There are many other representatives here from different kinds of agencies on how the politics of aid informs these kinds of debates, whether we should be merging, how we should be structuring. I mean, what have you seen? And you've talked a bit in your book about it, so...
I think Nilima is absolutely right that we need to examine the motivations for some of these decisions. If you pay attention to this sector, some of them are quite obvious, and some of the timing is often quite obvious too. Some of these mergers back happened during or after the Great Recession, and they happened on the basis of a justification of austerity and cost saving. But in fact, were conservative agendas. Maybe aid is a very easy target of opportunity. It's a very easy bargaining chip to use with certain corners of your base as a politician, especially with fiscal conservatives or those who oppose internationalism, those who oppose the welfare state. It's easier to throw aid to them than it is to dismantle the NHS or to dismantle the Foreign Office. So a lot of this is opportunism, which is not to say that there are not legitimate grounds for potential mergers or a subordination of aid agencies to diplomacy to political objectives, especially when aid is pursuing political goals or even when it's pursuing politically smart methods where you can benefit from interfacing with diplomatic staff. But also think of the outcomes. If mergers lead to a reduced space for creativity in an aid agency, if it leads to a much more limited understanding of the aims, or if it leads to the complete abandonment of things that we would consider to be socially desirable as aid objectives, then I think it's a negative.
Thank you. Dan, looking over my shoulder as if he's there. Over to you. I mean, I in preparing for this event, I was looking at your website, right? And you've got a quote up on there from James Q. Wilson. Organization matters even in government agencies. The key difference between more and less successful bureaucracies has less to do with finances, client populations, or legal arrangements than with organizational systems, right? So we're talking a bit about this sort of saying, no matter whether it's merged or not, we have to get the systems right, and we can make it work no matter what, even if it comes together. But it'd be nice to hear from you, Dan, based on your research. What does it even mean to get the organizational systems right for an aid bureaucracy? It's not easy.
Yeah, first just to echo that, it's not at all easy. I guess for me the question is, it strikes me that a few folks, in fact, everyone talked in some way about how the question isn't the formal structure, but what the kind of outputs or, implications of that structure are for what happens in the field. And so, to me, getting the organizational system right starts with something Vel said, which is empowering country teams, right? Putting those closest to the action in charge of what happens, particularly when we have the kinds of projects, the kinds of interventions that are really going to benefit from local information, local knowledge, et cetera. And so in that sense, I think, so in my research, one of the things I do is I ask people on the recipient country side how empowered people are in the field. So that is, I'm asking people who work for aid management offices in developing countries. You deal with a lot of donors. Who needs to go back to headquarters more? And who is more able to kind of make decisions locally? And while DFID scores quite high on that measure, let me say, there's not a kind of systematic relationship between agency independence and a high sort of autonomy or empowerment score, which suggests that it's not merely or even mostly formal structure that dictates what actually happens in terms of these kinds of locus of control, autonomy, independence kind of issues. And so, organizational systems, of course, rest on political decisions. But in some ways, it seems to me it's more easy for politics to get it wrong than get it right. So that is to say, for political reasons, we can bring in rules and constraints that preclude people from operating in the way that's likely to best deliver development assistance. But if we avoid doing that, that doesn't mean problem solved. That means we just have a whole new set of questions we need to ask about kind of the internal management of agencies and control and delegation and reporting. And as you suggested, we'll talk about earlier, maybe accountability with it.
Yeah, great, thanks, Dan. We'll come back to the accountability question in a bit more depth and kind of, or empowered accountability, as I think David puts it within its smart rules. I wanted to give the chance before because we have to rush through a lot of stuff today, and we'll get to come back to some of it in the Q&A. I want to come back to you briefly, Nalima, because we didn't get to hear the chance because of the short time around some of the examples that you might give around comparing between different agencies, right? Because the detail really matters on some of these questions for then how things actually unfold in reality. So I wonder if you could give us a bit of detail on some of these examples.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly present you with some of the details around the mixed record for achieving efficiency, impact, and policy coherence. So on the efficiency measure, if you look at Australia and Canada post-merger, the data is collected 3 years post-merger, 2013, the merger does appear to have tipped both countries to a DAC average, so it's lowered administrative cost as collected by the DAC, and that those measures are notoriously unreliable, but they're the best measure we have, or best proxy for efficiency. But what's interesting is you need to interpret that improving efficiency post-merger by looking at factors that might also have driven that increased efficiency. So for example, there were a large number of public sector layoffs in both countries that occurred unrelated to the merger itself that might be driving those results. There also seems to have been a desire, particularly in Australia, to transition away from direct implementation of programs to really be much more a commissioning agency. And interestingly enough, DFID, the independent agency in Model 4 in the DAX categories of these models, performs better than both Canada and Australia on efficiency on this metric, which begs the question, why merge? If you have an example, very prominent example of a consolidated development ministry that is doing well on efficiency. On coherence as well, you seem to find, if we look at the proxy we use for coherence, policy coherence, there's an ebb and flow to performance on coherence with Australia and Canada. And in some years post-merger, you have worse scores on policy coherence than pre-merger. And there's some literature to suggest that post-merger there can be challenges of bringing together different communities and cultures of practice across the development diplomatic divide in particular, where timelines, clarity of purpose, and different results are sought. So perhaps I don't see a merger as benign as perhaps as you do. I think there are serious micro-level organizational issues that have to be fleshed out. And I think ideally the first step towards a merger would be building that political support to make the merger a success. In other words, the merger will only be as successful as the political support it has, and the ability really to safeguard the integrity of the development side in particular, because I think the organization being merged is more vulnerable than the host to which it's merged to. Yeah.
That's perfect. I want to immediately come to, Val, you've got one anyway. I'm not even going to ask a question then. Yeah, let's hear your comment.
Well, look, I don't want to say a merger is benign or not, or I don't really even want to formally comment on any of that because it's political. I guess what I want to say, though, is there are big structural and organisational questions for DFID, of which I would not put a merger top. I mean, there are other questions like, what's our role as countries get richer? You know, do we shift from grant-based aid to other types of financial instruments? What does that mean for what our people are doing? Are they spending less time managing money and more time building relationships and influencing? I think that's a big structural organisational question for us. Similarly, I think this question of DFID as a strategic commissioning organisation, you know, we enter into agreements with partners, whether that's multilaterals or NGOs or private sector, to deliver development impact for us. And we make that make versus buy decision. That in different ways in all different places. And I think there's a very big question for us about how we make that decision and how we at least bring more consistency and coherence. So I think basically, I don't want to kind of, I just think the merger question can take us down a path that may or may not be useful, but I think there's lots of other important questions that I don't want to lose sight of in the kind of structural governance space for different.
That's really helpful. Leads me on to our second question, actually, because I think one of the key ways that I've seen DFID, but also a range of other development agencies try and set incentives to kind of deliver aid well is through results, value for money. You know, they're both in the narrative, but also in the tools and the processes that we've seen used, right? Particularly over the last decade or so, but it stretches back further than that in aid history. And so, you know, we have the question, which is what are the pros and cons of results-based management, and are there alternatives to value for money, which has a little bit of a slight criticism in it already. Partly because we shaped the question for Pablo, right? Because we wanted to hear, his book Why We Lie About Aid has some criticisms of results and value for money. So, in many respects, we know the pros and cons, right, Pablo? Like we have a sense of them, of results-based management. Yet my own sense from my research is that we struggle, despite knowing some of the cons, to escape them. And so I'd wonder, from your perspective and your research, what do you see as if there are the problems, and if you agree with me, what are those major challenges? What do you see as the biggest challenge? And have you got some creative ideas for getting around it? Because to my mind, we're still stuck a little bit.
Okay, so let me start with a question, and indulge me. Was the French Revolution successful? Depends when you stop your story, right? If you stop in 1794, the terror, everybody was dying, it's a disaster. Although, a very small-minded VFM person may said, we expected one king's head cut, and we got it. So, A for that program. If you go to 1804, you have Napoleon, who's a dictator. Bad. But then he's instituting sort of a meritocratic system, which is sort of good. But then he invades other countries, which is bad. But then that invasion facilitates the diffusion of enlightened ideas to other countries that were not exposed to those ideas, planting the seeds of liberalism in many countries in Western Europe. So that's good. This is all to say that a lot in development is dependent on uncertainty and contingency. Value for money is obviously, and results-based management are, I would say, even moral obligations. In a liberal democracy, you're spending taxpayers' money. You have an obligation to account and to explain how you've spent things and why you took the decisions that you took. But a lot of the value for money pressure or incentive assumes a certain calculability, assumes that we're dealing with environments of risk in which we can anticipate and forecast based on what we know right now. When in fact a lot of development processes, especially those that have to do more with institutional change, are subject to uncertainty. We don't even know which players will be relevant 2 years down the line. We don't even know whether their preferences will change or what catalysts may completely throw our assumptions out. So it is there that I'm worried about value for money, the fact that the frameworks, as employed in a perverse way, maybe not by design, but by the inertia that we have, are leading us to what Andrew Natsios called the more measurable but less transformative areas of development assistance. I do think that there are ways that you can work with existing frameworks, like log frames, theories of change, and so on. Theories of change were supposed to be empowering, right? And in fact, when you're dealing with uncertainty, you need a theory or some values to guide yourself. But theories of change tend to be some of the weakest elements of business cases, for instance, for DFID and for provider bids. Log frames tend to be very constraining. They tend to be straitjackets that do not allow for creativity. They can, but that takes a number of things. It takes practitioners who want to do it. It takes providers who feel that this is a worthy pursuit despite some potential risks to their business. It takes DFID SROs who say, yeah, let's tackle some interesting problem. It takes DFID M&E people who are open-minded. It takes DFID contract management people who are not going to be put off by a bit of uncertainty. And it's too complicated at times to get all those pieces together. But I think it's doable, right? But I think it's a conversation that needs to involve more people, not just the external speakers or opinion makers or insiders in DFID. It applies throughout the chain of implementation.
I want to ask other people about this, but I'm going to come back to you very briefly on the issue of the latter part of my question, right, around creative solutions to this. Because what I hear there is that if you have the right people in place, you can do the alternatives to a narrow, a better understanding of results and value for money. But is that enough? Is that enough as a suggestion to say that if you just get the right people in place? Because Natsios or other people may have said that we've had that criticism for a while, but getting past it's proved really difficult. And I think we have to have something a bit more than that, right? So, what do you think?
You're right, in the sense that you can get all the right people, and that doesn't necessarily mean somebody who has a title on adaptive development or anything like that. A lot of seasoned professionals think adaptively and politically already. But those constellations of creative people can very easily dissipate, right? And what you see, if you look at DFID offices, for instance, sorry to specify DFID, but DFID is sort of a leader in thinking differently about problems in development. What you see is that interesting projects pop up as professionals move from office to office, basically. There's no continuity of effort because there's no internalization. Part of it is that there's no real incentive or directive to record knowledge about how decisions were made and why certain decisions were made. Lessons are not really kept. Lessons travel with the people who learn them. And this creates a risk for DFID in particular, but for all donors, in that how long can you keep in your employment those risk takers when they're being told over and over again that they're not doing the right thing? At some point they will leave and they will go to the private sector or they will go to the charity sector. And then who will be designing and commissioning the really interesting projects? Who will be providing the political space for those individuals to do, as Dan would say, navigate by judgment?
Great. I'm actually going to come straight to you, Val, because I just feel like it makes a lot of sense. We've had conversations before about DFID and results, gender, and value for money, and how if it needs to be reframed, how it might be done. So I'm interested to get your, if you can provide any update or any, sense of where DFID is going or attempting to go on these agendas in the light of some of the criticisms and some of the evolution that's going on in the organisation.
Sure, I'll give it a go. I agree with a lot of what Pablo's said, and it comes actually to the third question on sort of on people and empowerment, but maybe just in terms of where we are at this. So we've been thinking about this, where to take results, gender and DFID. We've been thinking about it for a while, partly informed by ODI's work, but also the IDC and lots of work out there now. So the kind of things I've got in my mind, and I scribbled them down because this is very, very live for us at the moment. So the first thing for me is really getting clear the distinction between targets and results-based management. And I think all this got brigaded kind of under the results agenda as it first evolved in DFID. We were set targets, get 11 million children into school. I can't remember the other ones, but that was something I was very closely involved in. Still have the scars. But targets drive a lot of those incentive effects that others have written about and know far more than I do. So what we're trying to do is make sure we're clear about the difference between targets and results-based management. They're two different things, and let's make sure we're really clear about that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is acknowledging all these limitations that the result associated with the results agenda. Some stuff can't be measured: governance, security, those kind of really difficult, institution building, all that stuff that's really difficult to measure. The drive to what you can measure, the risk that you drive people to vaccines as opposed to systems, whatever. The risk of short-termism over long-termism, the devaluing of theories of change, all of that stuff, I think, we just have to kind of, I think, as an organisation, acknowledge that there are challenges and limitations. And so this comes to your point, Pablo, making sure we don't tell people off for doing the wrong thing. We don't want to be doing that. We want to say, actually, there is some validity in those concerns. So I think that's the second thing. And how do we create a culture that sort of kind of moves us on from where we are at the moment? That said, one of the discussions I'm always involved in with people is, how do we make sure people, our staff, still recognise they have to be able to articulate what they're achieving? So we can't just say results don't matter. It doesn't matter what you're achieving. And, you can, this is the example I use a lot, you can spend millions on paying salaries into a health system in the hope of getting system reform and buying enough influence to change policy, which may work, may not work, but you need to be able to articulate something about what you're achieving there over time. So we still need to maintain incentives on that and finding a way to square that, getting the results agenda in the place that's fit for purpose without telling people it's okay just to forget about the story about what you're achieving. That's something we're struggling with. And then lastly, how do we use this stuff in decision making? So there's a lot of talk about unit cost data. If it costs $500 to get a girl into school in Somalia and it costs $10 in Ethiopia, can you just not put all the money in Ethiopia instead of Somalia? That kind of unit cost data, there's a lot of interest in us being able to get to that point. Obviously, we all know the challenges in that kind of data, but how we bring a higher level of quantitative underpinning to our decision making is something we have to crack, and we haven't quite cracked that yet. As opposed to sort of, at the moment, it's based very much on country level resource allocation decisions. So that kind of portfolio level decision making, we need to find a way to answer that question.
I'm going to come to Nalima first. I might come back to you, Pablo, if we have time. I know you've worked with a lot of different agencies. Since joining ODI, I know a lot about the different ones you worked with, including CEDA and others. And I wonder, it's easy for people like us, in fact, to write up, criticisms or something of how we've seen things unfold. But have we got decent examples of how different organisations have approached this, and then it's been written up well? How do you get that balance right between some of the tensions that Val's talking about, like using quantification, but not overdoing it, so that people feel constrained by it? What have you seen in working with different agencies on that?
Yeah, I'll answer your question and link back to your comment about the need for staff to be able to articulate what they're achieving. And I think that requires us to trust that explanation for what they are achieving, particularly if it's not conducive to measurement, let's say. And I think sort of to answer your question about comparative evidence, it's interesting to look at Sweden, I think, where they sort of started from a place around 2006 where results-based management was very much a kind of central paradigm in managing foreign aid. And in 2016, there was a lot of frustration, essentially, with that paradigm. And by 2016, the government asked a special commission on how to inculcate trust in the public administration as a part of a broader public management reform system. A delegation on trust was charged with inspiring the public sector at all levels to alter the kind of RBM logic. It had no formal authority, this delegation, but really a mandate to propose administrative systems that could be built on improving trust. Now, I think this example of Sweden really is an attempt to really change the parameters, the public narrative around value for money and results-based management, really trying to change what we mean by accountability and trying to encourage trust in our civil servants. And the report from this commission came out last week and suggested that governance really should be designed so it does not involve more detailed control than necessary. So there's a minimum, right, that we use for control. Culture and leadership should have a much more prominent role. Target and performance management should be less detailed, more enabling, more closely designed in consultation with professional frontline workers and so on. And I think Sweden's a great example of trying to change that public narrative on accountability, and I know we're going to come to that later. In contrast, you look at the UK. The UK scores one of the lowest on the Edelman 2018 Barometer survey on trust, in particular in public institutions. Only Ireland, South Africa, Japan, and Russia score lower. And the UK is lower than the US, China, Brazil, Colombia, India. Many of countries you question sort of governance arrangements in. And I think audit societies, to use Michael Power's term, are predicated on a lack of trust. And the worry that I have is that we don't have the trust in this country in our public institutions that would allow us to go beyond the kind of narrow conceptualization of results-based management and all the kind of disadvantages that might bring.
Yeah, thanks, Nalima. I think it's a nice transition to our third question, actually, Dan. So sorry to not give you a shot on this, but I think it's really relevant. I mean, the issue of trust when you're talking about empowering staff and them still being accountable, right? This is a massive issue. So the formal question that we have for you is around how can empowering staff be made tangible and still comply with the need to maintain formal accountability? Your book title is Navigation by Judgment, right? So the natural, and if I was being a skeptic, you'd say, if you're navigating by judgment, where is the accountability? How would you respond to that as a question? How do you see that?
Yeah, so let me talk, if I could, just for, 30 seconds about the book's findings as they as they, sort of relate to the conversation I think we're having. Which is, I use 8 case studies and the world's largest database of development project outcomes, which is 14,000 projects across 9 donors across 40 years, across 180 recipient contexts, to ask questions of when tight controls are generating results and when they aren't, in some sense, right? And what kinds of controls are associated with what kinds of outcomes and what kinds of contexts. And so, in that sense, I guess where I start is, Vel talked about the quantitative underpinnings of results. And I would say that one of the things I hope to kind of contribute to this conversation is the idea that I think we have reasonably good quantitative evidence that our sort of simplification of results, as you, I think, very eloquently put it, into kind of targets and what's measurable, does have deleterious consequences and has them differentially based on the kind of environment we're in and the kind of task we're undertaking. When we're trying to build a road, those kinds of controls might work quite well. When we're trying to manage a transportation system, much less so. And so, how do we square judgment with accountability? Well, I would say crowding out judgment is, if crowding out judgment is undermining results, it's not obvious to me how, if the tools we're calling accountability are actually hurting the interventions around which we are trying to be accountable, that we are getting much out of this accountability narrative. So that is to say, if that target for 11 million children, right, leads to, as Lant Pritchett has put it, a schooling ain't learning kind of outcome, where we get people in schools but not a lot of learning as a result, it's not obvious to me that that accountability tool, if indeed that's the outcome, has driven us towards the direction we want accountability to take us. So what does it mean to be accountable? I think there's a ton of wisdom in everyone's responses to the last question, which is, it's about kind of turning accountability from counting, from making to something more like making a count, as Nalima was talking about in kind of the Swedish context. And that also depends very much on sort of issues of trust. But I think in the public sector, in the UK and otherwise, we see examples of accountability that's quite consistent with navigation by judgment. When a surgeon performs a complicated surgery, that surgeon is reviewed by a community of peers who think about what the kind of appropriate actions would have been in a similar circumstance, and whether and what can be learned from the particular incident. So, judging judgment requires, and whether it's been operated, whether it's been kind of executed correctly, doesn't mean just kind of throwing any sort of standard of performance and accountability to the wind. I think it means relying on different kinds of tools that may require more trust, both of the agency and within the agency through, as I think Pablo put it, the chain of delegation, the chain of delivery that we see in aid. And fundamentally, it seems to me that if formal accountability, as it's currently constituted, means we are getting less out of our interventions, then we don't need to rethink the interventions. We need, consistent with that accountability, we need to rethink what we call accountability and what it is to be accountable. Because if before what we had was a false sense of our success, well, that was a Pyrrhic victory. And what instead we need is to maximize results for taxpayers and for beneficiaries. And anything that carries us in that direction can't help but be a step towards being more accountable on both ends of the kind of delegation chain, both up to taxpayers and down to recipients.
Thanks, Dan. I want to come straight back to you, if that's all right, just to follow up on something
Sure.
that you mentioned. I mean, it links back to our second question as well around results-based management. One of the big criticisms that people typically have is that it can be gamed, right? And so you set up a results artifice, and then you just go and do what you're doing, and you can game the system. It seems to me that in navigation by judgment, there's equal possibilities for gaming, for kind of, you chalk everything up to learning. The surgeon gets things wrong. Oh, it's a learning experience, it's fine, but actually someone's died, right? So there's a real challenge there of how you can have a rigorous process that still allows navigation by judgment that works with people's expertise. So I wonder what response you'd have to that this is a even more gameable system than the one that we're arguably trying to replace.
Yeah. So first, I want to say I think we use the word gaming a little bit inconsistently when we talk about it in the kind of quantitative result sense. So that is to say, to use the example that was put on the board earlier, if you drive to putting kids in schools because that is what the target is, I would say you aren't gaming that target. You're responding in a totally consistent way to the kind of measures, right? So I see gaming as when you sort of distort the measure to serve your own interests internal to what that measure is. And I would say that we need to think about both those problems. We need to think about both when we're not driving to the right kind of codification of results, and when driving to that codification opens up opportunities for waste, fraud, abuse, mistakes, those kinds of things. And so, it strikes me that I don't know that I think, maybe the rest of the room doesn't share my prior on this, but I don't know that I think that relying on judgment is inherently more gameable than relying on measures when those measures are kind of these sort of broad summary statistics that don't capture what, in fact, we may want out of our interventions. That said, I also don't think there's nothing we can do to limit the kind of risk that I agree with you is real in that kind of a system. And so, the surgeon doesn't get to chalk everything up to learning, because if the surgeon keeps making similar kinds of mistakes, there are consequences, right? If, I don't know, since you mentioned it's a World Cup game for England today, right? If I'm in Man U's training academy and I keep making the same kinds of errors in judgment, I'm not going to get promoted to the next team. That also doesn't mean the first time I make an error, the right response is to send me back to, I don't know, Milton Keynes or wherever I came from, right? So there's a balance there. And that balance has to be achieved through a kind of understanding of what it means to get better at these things. And that links pretty directly to the kind of personnel management story that both Vel and Pablo were pointing to earlier. I think we make a mistake that thinking that because something involves people, it can't be systematic. That is to say, one thing you hear a lot in the aid world is, well, it really depends who's in the job, as if by saying that, we're saying, well, it's random who's in the job. It could be somebody who does the job well, it could be someone who does the job poorly. But one thing that, in my mind, is subtext to all of the comments made earlier is that who's in the job is a consequence of how we design the job, right? So when we think about managing performance and the structure of our agencies, we're not just changing how people perform in them today, we're also changing who comes into the agencies and who leaves the agencies in a way that affects the kind of composition of workers in a way that is deeply related to what the structure is. And so, is there a risk that if we chalk things up to judgment, we'll get fraud? Yes, of course there is. We worry that police after action reviews may bias towards certain kinds of actions and away from others. But that doesn't mean we throw out the review process. That's, to steal from Vel, throwing out in a different way the baby with the bathwater. What we do is we think about what the right sort of mix is of, to steal from Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. We can engage in trust. We can engage in judgment-based accountability. We can engage in something other than numbers and quantitative underpinnings as the sole tool of what it means to generate results, and still do accountability along those lines. And to me, it just comes down to, in some places, counting every penny is part of making sure every penny counts. And where it is, we should count every penny and drive towards those results. But where it isn't, we should seek reasonable alternatives. And are we going to get that perfect the first time? Probably not. But we need to experiment in our organizational systems, in our management technology, in just the way we think about experimenting in a whole bunch of other ways.
We're going to have to move on, Dan.
Inside.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Dan. We have to move on because we're going to run out of time. I want to get some. You mentioned earlier getting the perspectives of people in the audience. I want to leave a little bit of time for that on some of these. I wonder whether people do agree with you or not. Nalima, I mean, I know that from in your previous role, and of course you're still applying it. You looked at a lot of public management theory. You know, when you're at LSE and professor of that. I mean, what lessons can we take from that about whether this circle can be squared, right, between formal accountability on the one hand and actually allowing autonomy for people to get the job done?
I mean, in direct response maybe to Dan's points also and bringing in the theoretical perspective there, I don't think empowering staff is necessarily giving them complete freedom. And public management theory has theorized bounds to discretion, bounded discretion, or the idea that you can structure flexibility so that staff empowerment, autonomy, decision-making has boundaries that enable judgment rather than simply constrain its use. And so Yuan Ang has written a book recently on Chinese development experience, effectively, and looked at bounds on Chinese bureaucratic discretion, what Chinese bureaucrats couldn't do and what they had to do. But within that, she said there was, broadly speaking, a certain amount of space to figure out how to accomplish certain goals, and the government made it very clear that innovation was permitted without specifying exactly how it was to be done. Her term was directed improvisation. And so I think, there is space in bureaucracies in the developing world as much as in Western world bureaucracy for judgment to be exercised, but for us to also set limits to that exercise of that judgment. But the dilemma between accountability and flexibility, more generally speaking, is a central dilemma. It's a basic governance challenge. Last week, the FT had an article essentially on whether decentralized autonomy in the NHS being one of the largest employers in Europe, could really be compatible with centralized controls and political accountability. How can staff in the NHS or anywhere else be responsive to local realities and local demands of their patients, but also be responsible for their actions? And it's true, in the age we live in, the public is not ready to forsake accountability to achieve flexibility, no matter how much rhetoric we talk about flexibility, how much we throw at flexibility. And so I think we need to be mindful of this. And in my view, my personal view, I think there's two ways you can go about it. One is to take minor modifications to programs that can really accommodate at the margins the desire for flexibility without really sacrificing the conventional notion of public accountability as control and compliance. So, for example, within a particular project or program, create a specific pot of money for more riskier engagements. You can also outsource risk to third-party contractors, thereby absolving the contracting organization of blame. And I think we try and do that, and I think that many development agencies work within that kind of style of trying to allow some flexibility but still maintain a traditional kind of understanding of accountability to the taxpayer. A more maximal approach, I think, would be to really attempt to try and change the public discourse on what we mean by accountability. Really change the narratives so that we embrace trust. We basically reject zero tolerance of risk, and we accept there is risk in the development endeavor. And we are willing to tolerate exceptions to standard programmatic approaches, particularly, for example, in fragile states, which is the example very prominent in Dan's book about highly unpredictable environments, where maybe we do need more exceptions. And so I think there are two approaches really to square that circle of the challenge between accountability and flexibility.
Thanks, Nima. I mean, Val, in DFID, this is also a bit of a live issue, right? I mean, my own sense is that obviously it's historically pretty strongly decentralized, but that over perhaps the last decade or so, that there's been a bit of a pulling back towards the centre in different ways. For example, that heads of office can't spend as much, they can't sign off as much money anymore, and there's been a bit of a pullback towards that central power. I mean, how are you seeing that unfold in DFID at the moment, and to what extent do you feel that there is a kind of empowered accountability, as sort of talked about in the SMART rules for DFID staff?
So I think your diagnosis is a pretty fair reflection of what I think if you ask most DFID staff, they'd probably say. And I really like this concept of bounding. I'm going to kind of steal that language, Nalima. So I guess as I think through this, and one of the reasons I took this job was to think through this this challenge that faces us, I kind of increasingly try to separate this into two. So there's the policy empowerment, and then there's the compliance it's a bit of a caricature, but policy empowerment. So can a country head or an SRO in the field decide what to do? Pretty much, yes. They still have wide discretion and autonomy to decide what they want to do. And they are accountable for that. So if they choose to invest in a sensitive program and it goes wrong, then they're accountable. They have to explain why it went wrong and account for that. So that's the what. We then have the how, and and this is where I think it all gets a bit conflated. There, I think we talk about empowering teams, but actually a lot of those are compliance tasks over which they have no discretion. They have to put a business case to a minister, or they have to make sure their financial forecasts are uploaded on the system. They have to make sure their delivery chain is mapped. But we still brigade it under that empowered accountability lexicon. And I think we just have to sort of pull those apart a bit more. And I think there are probably some efficiencies in some of that compliance stuff that I'm thinking about. A lot of people in the room have probably mentioned this to people in DFID, that we do some of that compliance stuff in a very inefficient way. We can sort of liberate our frontline teams to spend more time on the what, if we can sort of change some of that how, where we're kind of, I think we just got to make sure the rhetoric matches the reality a bit on that. So, I mean, it's not a kind of complete answer to that question, but it's something we're really thinking through now, and I think it kind of recognises a lot of what Nilima was talking about. Yeah,
no, thank you for that. I mean, I'll come to Pablo, that's all right. And in your book, you make quite a strong argument for what is probably currently a relatively marginal set of practices in the aid industry, right, for a different way of approaching things. And what you might argue is more transformative. So I wonder if you could just tell us, what that is very briefly, because we're a little short on time. But then also how, within your different way of thinking about things, you maintain this accountability. My understanding is you would want a significant amount of autonomy and flexibility for people to act.
Okay, so what is transformative? Transformative is building, to some extent, self-sustaining systems, right? Systems that will persist once the aid program pulls out. Inevitably, the aid program will pull out, or the donor will pull out. And if you spend 5 years working on a sector, even if you reach all your targets, even if you're fully accountable, if that effort is not sustainable, effectively that's a wasted effort and a wasted amount of money, in my view. And I'm an aid supporter, okay? So I'm not a skeptic, but let's be realistic. I think a lot of effort in development should be shifting or could be shifting towards more catalytic interventions. Interventions that seek not to disperse funding necessarily into the local procurement system, but to build projects that identify and target opportunities for change, working with local actors, and that cultivate those local partnerships and empower those local actors who are going to stay there after the consultants leave and the DFID advisors leave. I think this is completely possible under the current system of compliance mechanisms in DFID, for instance. And we talk about DFID, this is a good problem to have. Other donors are not really even talking about effectiveness, okay? So this is a good conversation to have. You can still have all your compliance requirements and all your accountability framework if you change 3 assumptions, or you allow for 3 changes in the way we think. 1, learning programs have greater overhead costs. You need more staff time devoted to capturing lessons, facilitating learning and reflection, and especially if you want to be transparent, putting things on paper and disseminating it to the right audience, okay? So that means that your VFM section of your quarterly report cannot just be your staffing costs and what that is. 2, programs need to be built in such a way that we expect that a certain percentage of activities within a program will fail, inevitably, right? And then our task is to properly identify which ones are failing and which ones are succeeding, why, and learn and improve. 3rd, and this is going to sound really, really disappointing to some people, maybe the objective of some DFID programs is to lay the groundwork for a future DFID program. There are some reform contexts that are so hard to tackle that the best that you can hope for right now is to begin building a constituency for change. That means that the objective of a program should not be an immediate change in policy or a change in some quantifiable outcome, but a changing in the foundations that will allow for a better DFID program to be built in 3 to 5 years. I think all of this is possible, but unfortunately, a lot of this is reliant on personality and personal relationships, particularly because providers, whether they're firms or charities, feel accountability in a contractual sense and in a reputational sense. And they may be very afraid to do some of these things lest they risk their reputation and their ability to bid on future projects. So if DFID creates, DFID advisors or DFID teams create a more welcoming space, you can still be fully accountable and creative and transformative, and more honest, maybe. I think this is happening right now. It's not systematic, but it can happen.
Thanks, Pablo. That's really helpful.